The first tree I ever planted died within a week. I remember standing over it in the gray morning light, my fingers still dark with soil, watching the single small leaf curl inward, like it was trying to hide from the world. Someone laughed behind me. I didn't turn around to see who. I never did back then. Turning around meant meeting eyes, and meeting eyes meant giving them something to react to. I just knelt there and pressed my palm flat against the earth beside the thin little trunk, feeling the cold damp seep into my skin, and I thought, try again. That was 8 years ago. I was 22, newly settled at the edge of the Ashevale territory, and already understood to be something the pack tolerated rather than welcomed. An Omega without a family line, without a history anyone cared to trace. I'd arrived carrying 2 bags, and a silence that people mistook for emptiness, which I suppose was easier for them than the truth, which was that I simply had nothing left to say to people who had already decided what I was. The Ashevale pack was large, structured, and proud of both. They occupied the northern stretch of a mountain valley where the seasons were sharp and unforgiving, winters that pressed down hard, summers that came fast and left without apology. The hierarchy here wasn't cruel exactly, but it was absolute. Alphas led, betas organized. Omegas existed in the margins and were expected to feel grateful for it. I was expected to feel grateful. Instead, I planted trees. It started small, a few seedlings along the northern slope where the land was thin and rocky, and nobody went. I chose that spot precisely because nobody went there. The soil was difficult, almost hostile, full of stones that had to be moved by hand before anything could take root. But I liked difficult. Difficult meant the work was mine. No one would come to watch, to comment, to remind me what I was. I planted ash first, because of the name of the territory. A small foolishness, but it felt like a greeting. I see you. I'm part of you now, whether you want me or not. Then rowan, then hawthorn, then a line of young birches that trembled in the mountain wind like nervous girls at a formal occasion. By the time I was 24, I had a small grove. By 26, I had a forest in progress that stretched nearly half a kilometer along the slope, irregular and wild and nothing like the clean-ordered gardens closer to the settlement's center. And people laughed. Not always openly. Some of it was the particular laughter of people who want you to know you're being watched but not confronted. A sound at the edge of a crowd, a comment that reaches you just as you've passed. The Omega and her trees. That was what they called it. The project, the obsession. Said with a tone that managed to hold pity and mockery in equal measure. Even some of the other Omegas kept a careful distance, as though association with something that ridiculous might be catching. You know it doesn't help anything, a woman named Petra told me once. She wasn't unkind. She was practical in the way that people become when life has pressed them flat enough times. She stood at the edge of my northern slope with her arms crossed, looking at the young trees with the expression of someone trying to understand a language they've never studied. It's not food. It's not shelter. It's not protection. The pack won't think better of you for it. I know, I said. Then why? I didn't answer right away. I was tying back a young rowan branch that kept pulling toward the ground, finding the angle that would let it grow outward instead of down. The sky above us was the particular pale blue of early autumn, stretched thin over the mountain peaks. Because something should grow here, I finally said. Something should want to. Petra looked at me for a long moment. Then she shook her head and walked back toward the settlement, and I heard nothing more about it from her, though I heard plenty from others. The Ashevale Alpha at that time was a man named Doran, who was fair-minded and unmemorable in equal measure. He didn't care about the trees one way or another, which meant he didn't stop them, which meant they kept growing. I was low enough in the hierarchy that nothing I did required his attention. That changed when Doran stepped down. The transition had been building for over a year. He was aging, his authority thinning at the edges, and the pack had begun the slow political lean toward whoever would replace him. There were 3 candidates of significant standing, but everyone understood that the one who mattered was the one arriving from the Eastern Territories, Aiden Voss. I heard his name the way I heard most important things, through the ambient noise of a community that forgot I was present. Standing near the supply house while 2 beta men talked across a table, sitting outside the meeting hall while voices filtered through old wood walls, walking the perimeter path while a group of women spoke with the particular energy of people anticipating something they're not sure they want. What I gathered, piece by piece, was this. Aiden Voss had taken the alpha title of his birth territory at 28, held it for 6 years, and was now being offered a consolidation. 2 packs under one authority, Ashvale absorbing into a broader structure with him at its head. He was described, depending on who was speaking, as either exactly what we need or more than we're ready for. There was respect in both versions. There was fear in both versions too, though the speakers would not have named it that. He arrived on a Tuesday in late October, when the first real cold had come down from the mountain and the trees on the northern slope were doing what I had waited 3 years to see. The birches going gold, the rowans burning a deep amber red that was almost violent against the gray rock behind them. I was up there when the convoy of vehicles came through the valley road below. I watched from a distance, my hands in my coat pockets, dirt under my nails. He was tall. That was the first thing visible even from far away. And he moved through the crowd that gathered to receive him the way water moves through a space that hasn't been designed for water. Finding every gap, adjusting nothing about itself to fit. I went back to my trees. The pack meeting 3 days later was mandatory. All members, full attendance, center hall at dusk. I arrived on time, which for me meant early enough to find a position near the back where I could see without being seen. The hall smelled of pine resin and old stone and the particular warmth of too many bodies in an enclosed space. Someone had lit the long iron candelabra along the walls, and the light was amber and unsteady, moving with the drafts. He stood at the front without performing it. That was the thing I noticed first, that he wasn't performing authority. Some leaders fill a room by working at it, by reading every face and calculating every word. Aiden Voss stood at the front of the Ashvale Hall and simply existed in it, and the room organized itself around him without being asked. He was perhaps 34, dark-haired, weathered in the way that came from actual weather rather than aesthetic choice. His expression was neutral in a way that was harder to read than anger or warmth. A face that gave very little away because very little needed to be given. He spoke about the consolidation plainly, about what would change, what would remain. He spoke about his expectations, not demands, but the kind of clear articulation of standard that left no room for confusion. He answered questions with the same directness. When someone pushed back, he acknowledged it without softening and without escalating. I watched him the way I watched most things, carefully from a distance, taking note without attachment. Then he asked if there was anything else, and in the brief silence that followed, the woman standing 2 people to my left, a young beta named Senna who sometimes passed my slope and occasionally raised a hand in greeting, said unprompted, "You should know about the Omega's Grove, on the north slope. It's been there for years." The way she said it wasn't cruel. It also wasn't kind. It was the tone of someone surfacing a curiosity, offering it to the room without caring how it landed. Several people turned. Not toward Senna, toward me. I felt the attention like a change in temperature. Aiden Voss's gaze moved through the room and settled. I did not look away. I had learned by then that looking away only invited more. He looked at me for 3 seconds. I counted, because counting is the thing I do when I need to stay still. And then he said, with no particular inflection, "I'll see it in the morning." The room exhaled. I didn't. Because there was something in the way he'd said it, not dismissive, not amused, that felt less like a verdict and more like a question that hadn't been asked yet. I walked home through the cold dark, the mountain above me barely visible against the sky. And I thought about my trees standing up there in the October wind, amber and red and stubborn and entirely indifferent to whether anyone found them worthy. I thought, whatever he decides, they're already grown. But I also thought, and I didn't want to think it, didn't trust the wanting behind it, let him look. Let him actually look. Outside, the first frost was beginning to form, white and precise on every surface the dark had touched. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of fear, exactly. I had long ago made a kind of peace with being judged, the way you make peace with recurring weather. You don't enjoy it. You simply stop being surprised by it. But there was something about the way Aidan Voss had looked at me in that hall, steady, unreadable, with the particular quality of attention that doesn't announce itself as attention, that sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't identify as either heavy or light. I was up before dawn, which was normal. I made coffee in the small kitchen of the cabin I'd been assigned when I first arrived, a structure at the far edge of the settlement that nobody else had wanted, which suited me entirely. The windows faced north, toward the slope. On clear mornings I could see the tree line from here, a dark, irregular edge against whatever the sky was doing. That morning the sky was doing nothing dramatic, just the slow gray blue of earliest light, the frost still hard on the ground, the air carrying that particular cold that feels personal, like it knows exactly where your coat is thin. I dressed in layers and walked up before anyone else was moving. The grove in October was the best version of itself. I had always known this privately, but never said it to anyone, because saying it would have invited the question of why I cared, and that question always arrived with something sharp underneath it. But up here alone in the early cold, I could simply acknowledge it. The birches were extraordinary, a double row of them along the eastern edge, their white bark luminous even in low light, the remaining gold leaves catching the first suggestion of sun and holding it the way water holds color. The rowans had dropped most of their leaves but kept their berry clusters, deep red, almost black at the edges. And the hawthorns were a dense, complicated tangle that somehow looked intentional, like a sentence written in a language you don't speak but can still feel the rhythm of. The ash trees, the oldest, stood at the center of everything. 8 years of growth. Their branches had developed the particular authority of trees that have survived multiple hard winters. Not graceful exactly, but honest. Shaped by actual force, rather than ideal conditions. I walked the inner path I'd made between them, checking the ground, checking the younger specimens at the northern end where the soil was still difficult. A few weeks ago I'd planted 4 new saplings, oak, which was ambitious given the altitude. But I'd been preparing the soil for 2 seasons, and I thought they had a chance. I was crouched beside the second oak, pressing my fingers into the soil around its base to check the frost depth, when I heard footsteps on the slope below. I knew before I turned around. There's a specific quality to the footsteps of someone who is large and moves with genuine economy. No extra weight in the stride, no announcement of themselves. Aidan Voss came up the path I'd worn into the hillside over 8 years of daily walking, and he came alone, which I hadn't expected. I stood and faced him. He was wearing a dark coat, practical rather than formal, and in the early morning light without the amber candles in the crowded room, he looked less like an arriving authority and more like a man who had gotten up early to look at something he was genuinely curious about. That distinction felt important, though I couldn't have explained why. He stopped at the edge of the birch row and looked, not at me, at the trees. The silence lasted long enough that I had time to decide not to fill it, which took more effort than it should have. "How long?" he finally said. 8 years, the oldest ones. I nodded toward the ash trees at the center. The birches are 6. The hawthorns and rowans came in between. He walked forward slowly, into the grove proper, turning his head as he moved. I stayed where I was. There was something in his manner that was less inspection and more... I searched for the right word, and found it, reluctantly, absorption. He was taking it in the way you take in something that requires actual processing. He stopped at the largest ash tree and put his hand against the bark. I felt that gesture somewhere I wasn't prepared to feel anything. The Northern Territory had nothing like this, he said. It wasn't directed at me entirely. It had the quality of a thought that had moved outward without permission. What did it have? He looked over at me then, and I saw a brief recalibration in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the slight adjustment of someone who expected a different kind of response. Rock, he said. And more rock, and wind that came from a direction that made no sense given the geography. Something close to a smile moved across his face and was gone before it fully arrived. I catalogued it without reaction. The soil here is difficult too, I said. The first 2 years barely anything held. I lost most of what I planted. But you kept planting. Yes. He looked at the oak saplings then, found them without being directed, which meant he'd been paying attention on his way up the slope. He crouched beside the nearest one in the exact position I'd just been in, checking the frost depth with 2 fingers, and something about the gesture, its practicality, its absence of performance, made it difficult to maintain my usual careful distance. Oak at this altitude is difficult, he said. I know. You've prepared the soil. 2 seasons. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the small sapling. Then, why oak? It was such a direct question. Most people, when they asked about the trees at all, asked with a frame already built. Why bother? Why waste the time? Why does an Omega think this matters? The frame was usually the whole point of the question. His question had no frame. It was just the question. Oak lives longest, I said. I won't see it fully grown. Neither will you. But it will be here after both of us, and it will be here because someone decided the ground was worth preparing, even without the guarantee of seeing the result. He stood, turned to face me fully for the first time since he'd arrived. In the full morning light, the sun had crested the eastern ridge while we were talking, and now came sideways through the birch branches, striped and golden. I could see his face more clearly than I had in the hall. There was something worn about it that wasn't aging exactly. More like a specific kind of tiredness that came from carrying something heavy over a long distance. I recognized it. I'd seen it in my own reflection enough times. The pack laughed at this, he said, not a question. For years, I confirmed. And you continued. The trees didn't care whether they laughed. He looked at me for a long moment. The mountain was very quiet around us. A bird, something small, I couldn't see it, made a single sound somewhere in the hawthorns and then was still. Clara, he said, using my name for the first time, which meant he'd learned it before coming up here, which meant this visit had been something other than casual compliance with his own statement in the hall. Yes. I have a question, and I want you to answer it honestly rather than carefully. The distinction he drew, honestly rather than carefully, landed with a precision that told me this was a man who understood the difference between the two, which meant he'd encountered both in people who should have given him the honest version and hadn't. All right, I said. In 8 years, has anyone from this pack come up here and helped you? Not watched, not commented, helped. I thought about Petra, who had come to tell me it was pointless, and then left. I thought about Senna, who sometimes raised a hand from the path below. I thought about the various faces I'd seen at the edge of the slope over the years, curious, amused, bored, none of which had ever resolved into a presence beside me in the soil. No, I said. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, the kind of shift that would be invisible to someone not paying close attention. But I was always paying close attention. He looked back at the grove, the full sweep of it, the birches still holding their gold, the ash trees solid and dark against the brightening sky. And he said quietly, more to himself than to me, "That was their mistake." Then he turned and walked back down the slope, his footsteps steady and unhurried, and I stood among my trees in the cold morning light and tried to identify the sensation moving through my chest. It took me a moment. It was the sensation of being seen. Not assessed, not categorized, not filed into the appropriate place in someone else's understanding of the world. Seen. I pressed my palm against the bark of the nearest ash tree, my oldest habit, my most private gesture, and stayed there for a long time after his footsteps had faded. Below, the settlement was beginning to wake. Smoke from the first chimneys, distant voices, the ordinary sounds of a community moving into its day. In a few hours, I knew, the political work of the consolidation would resume. There would be meetings I wouldn't be invited to, and decisions made in rooms I wouldn't enter. But he had come up here first. Before any of that, I thought about that oak sapling, barely a hand's height above the soil, with 2 full seasons of preparation underneath it, and decades of growth ahead. Patience, I thought. You've always been good at patience. But patience felt different now than it had yesterday. Less like resignation, and more like something deliberate. A choice rather than a default. I didn't examine that distinction too closely. Not yet. The consolidation took 3 weeks to formalize. I knew this the way I knew most things about the PAC's official business, through the texture of daily life rather than direct information. The meeting hall was occupied every evening. Vehicles I didn't recognize came and went along the valley road. The senior betas moved through the settlement with the particular compressed energy of people managing too many variables at once, their conversations dropping to murmurs whenever someone peripheral came close. I was always peripheral. It was useful sometimes. What I gathered was that the transition was not entirely smooth. Ashvale had been independent for 3 generations, and independence, even when it becomes impractical, accumulates sentiment over time. There were members, older ones mostly, and a few of the higher-ranking betas who stood to lose positional authority in the new structure, who were compliant in the official meetings and resistant everywhere else. The kind of resistance that doesn't show its face directly, but moves through a community, like a draft through an old building. You feel it without being able to point to the source. I recognized that pattern too. What I didn't expect was to become in any way part of it. It started with Marin. Marin was one of the senior betas, 40-something, sharp-featured, with the kind of authority that came from having held a position long enough that people forgot to question whether she was actually good at it. She had been Doran's primary administrator, which meant she was now navigating the particular indignity of being excellent at a role that was being restructured around her. She had never spoken to me directly in 8 years. I was aware of her the way you're aware of weather systems that move through someone else's territory. Notable, not personal. That changed on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks into the consolidation process, when I came down from the slope to find her standing outside my cabin. She was not the kind of woman who waited anywhere without intention. The fact of her presence on my doorstep was itself a statement. "Clara," she said, with the specific tone of someone using your name as a tool rather than an address. "Marin." She looked past me toward the slope, then back at my face. "He's been up there again." It wasn't a question. I had seen him, twice more since the first morning, always early, always alone. The second time we had barely spoken, just moved through the grove in a parallel quiet that was, I had decided afterward, the most comfortable silence I had experienced in years. The third time he had asked me about the soil composition on the northern end, and we had talked for nearly an hour about root systems and mineral deficiency and the specific challenges of establishing anything living in ground that had been compressed by years of frost heave. I had not told anyone about any of this. There had been no one to tell. "Yes," I said to Marin. "People have noticed. People notice everything. It's a small settlement. She studied me with the expression of someone recalculating. You understand what it looks like. I understand what you think it looks like, I said. He came to see the grove. He said he would. He did. 3 times. The grove is large. Something moved through her expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite irritation. A third thing, more complicated. You're not what I expected, she said. You didn't expect anything. You never looked. The words came out level, without heat. I wasn't angry. I was simply done performing the particular smallness that had always been expected of me in exchanges like this one. Myron was quiet for a moment. Then, he's changing the territorial boundary designations. The northern slope falls under direct alpha jurisdiction in the new structure. Your grove is on that land. I absorbed this. I know. You could lose access. Or I could not. She looked at me for a long time. I looked back. The mountain wind came down between us and moved on, uninterested. Be careful, she finally said, and it was hard to tell whether she meant it as a warning or something else. She left. I stood in the cold morning air outside my cabin and thought about territorial boundaries and the particular way power rearranges the geography of a place when it changes hands. Then I went inside and made a second cup of coffee and thought about it some more. The 4th time Aiden came to the slope, he brought someone with him. A man named Cole, one of his inner circle from the Eastern Territory, a beta in his mid-30s with a quiet watchfulness that I recognized as the particular alertness of someone whose job was to notice things their principal might miss. Cole had been present at the consolidation meetings, always at the edge of the room, always taking note. He took note of me now, standing at the northern end of the grove where I was working on the drainage channel I'd been digging to help the young oaks through the winter wet. Aiden came over directly. Cole stayed at the tree line. You're digging in this cold, Aiden said. The ground isn't frozen yet. 2 more weeks and it will be. I didn't stop working. If I wait, the channel doesn't get done until spring, and the oaks may not make it through standing water. He crouched at the edge of what I'd dug, looking at the angle and depth the way someone looks at a thing when they're assessing whether the thinking behind it is sound. The slope runs east, he said. Yes. The channel redirects to that natural runoff line. I pointed. It's not elegant, but it works. Can I help? I looked up at him. He was already reaching for the second-handled tool I'd left leaning against the nearest birch. You don't have to, I said. I know. He picked up the tool. Where do you need the next section? We worked for 2 hours. Cole remained at the tree line, present and unobtrusive. The only sounds were the scrape of tools against soil and rock, the occasional wind through the birches, the distant sounds of the settlement below. Aiden worked with the same economy he moved with. No wasted effort, no performance of effort, just the actual thing. At some point, I became aware that this was the first time in 8 years anyone had worked beside me on this slope, and I chose not to examine the feeling that came with that awareness, because examining it felt dangerous in a way I couldn't yet fully name. Cole thinks I'm being strategic, Aiden said at one point, not breaking rhythm. Are you? A pause. I don't know yet. The honesty of that was startling. I turned it over in my mind while I worked and didn't respond immediately, because a response that quick would have been reflexive rather than true. That's a more honest answer than most people would give, I finally said. Most people aren't actually asking themselves the question. They decide what they're doing and then find the reason after. He hit a layer of compressed rock, adjusted his angle. I find that approach tends to create problems later. It does, I said. I've watched it create problems here for years. He looked over at me. Tell me. So I did, carefully at first, then less carefully, because there was something in his manner of listening that made careful feel unnecessary. I told him about the eastern grazing territory that had been mismanaged for a decade because the beta responsible had decided his approach was correct before testing it, and no one below him in the hierarchy had felt safe saying otherwise. I told him about the water distribution disagreement that had fractured 3 Omega families for 2 years because the person with authority to resolve it had been too proud to admit the original decision was flawed. Small things, maybe, in the scope of pack governance, but the texture of daily life is made of small things. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching this pack for 8 years, he said. "From the edges, yes. The edges see things the center doesn't. The center rarely wants to know that. I want to know that." I stopped working, looked at him directly. He was already looking at me, and there was nothing in his expression that resembled the performance of interest. No political calculation visible on the surface. No careful management of how the attention was landing. Just the thing itself. The wind came through the birches again, pulling the last few gold leaves free, spinning them down between us. "Why?" I said, not challenging, genuinely asking. He took a moment before answering. When he did, his voice was level, but carried something underneath it. That specific worn quality I had seen in his face on the first morning, the weight of long distance. "Because I've led a territory for 6 years," he said, "and the worst decisions I made were the ones where no one around me felt safe enough to tell me what they actually saw. I have good people, loyal people, but loyalty, without the trust to speak plainly, is just a more elegant version of silence." He paused. "I don't want more silence." I thought about 8 years of silence, of working on this slope while laughter came up from below, of pressing my palms into difficult soil because the work was true even when nothing else felt that way. "Neither do I said quietly. Cole, at the tree line, made no visible reaction, but I had the distinct impression that he had heard everything and was filing it away with the particular care of someone who understood that certain conversations are more significant than they appear on the surface. I went back to digging. So did Aiden. We finished the drainage channel as the light was failing, the sky above the mountain going from pale gold to a deep blue that was almost violet at the horizon. I stood and straightened, feeling the ache in my lower back that always came after this kind of work, and looked at what we'd done. It wasn't beautiful. It was a ditch, functional and plain, curving through the earth to protect 4 small trees that most of the pack still considered a waste of time. But it was finished, and it would work. "Same time tomorrow?" Aiden said. I turned to find him watching me with that same unreadable expression, except that I was beginning, slowly and against my better instincts, to read it after all. There was something there, not a declaration, not a move in a political game, just a man who had found something on a hillside that was worth coming back to. "I'll be here at dawn," I said. He nodded once and walked back down the slope with Cole quiet beside him, and I stood in the last of the light surrounded by my trees and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But the ground where hope grows, carefully prepared, waiting. The night everything changed came without warning, the way the things that matter most usually do. It had been 4 weeks since the consolidation was formalized. Aiden's authority over the unified territory was official now, documented and announced, and the pack had settled into the particular uneasy equilibrium of a community that has accepted a change in its bones, even if not everyone has accepted it in their hearts. The open resistance had quieted. The underground kind, the draft through the old building, had not. I had been aware of it sharpening. Small things. A supply request I'd submitted for the Grove. Basic materials, nothing unusual, that was processed and then quietly reversed without explanation. A boundary marker that appeared one morning at the lower edge of the northern slope, placed precisely at the point where my oldest ash trees began. as though someone wanted to remind me that the ground I'd been working for 8 years had a jurisdiction I didn't control. A conversation I wasn't meant to hear between two of Marin's longtime allies that used the word liability in a way that wasn't about finance. I noted these things and said nothing. Not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, but because I had learned over 8 years that the moment you name the pressure being applied to you, the people applying it deny it with such confidence that the denial becomes its own kind of pressure. Better to watch. Better to know exactly what you're dealing with before you decide what to do with the knowing. I told Aiden on a Tuesday morning, standing at the northern end of the grove where the oak saplings were surviving their first hard cold, with the particular stubborn dignity of things that have been given a real foundation. I told him plainly, the way he had asked me to speak, honestly rather than carefully, all of it. The supply reversal, the boundary marker, the conversation. He listened without moving. When I finished, the silence lasted long enough that I began to question whether plainness had been the right choice after all. Then he said, "How long have you known?" The marker appeared 9 days ago. The conversation was 6 days ago. You waited. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. He looked at the boundary marker, visible from where we stood, a wooden post with a red band, aggressively ordinary. Something moved through his expression that was quiet and absolute, the way deep water is quiet and absolute. "I'll handle it," he said. "I'm not telling you so you'll handle it," I said. "I'm telling you because you asked me to tell you what I see." He turned to look at me fully. Both things can be true. I held his gaze. "Yes," I said, "they can." He handled it, and he did it publicly, which I hadn't anticipated. The following evening's pack assembly was not announced as a disciplinary matter. It was framed as a routine consolidation update, which meant full attendance, which meant everyone was present when Aiden addressed the boundary marker directly, naming it for what it was, an unauthorized assertion of jurisdictional pressure against a pack member, executed without his knowledge or sanction. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a quality to his authority in that room that made volume irrelevant, the kind of presence that compresses the air around it slightly, so that everything said within it carries more weight than the words alone. Marin, to her credit, didn't flinch. She stood in the middle of the assembly and acknowledged the marker had been placed at her direction, and she framed it as a practical administrative decision about territorial clarity during the transition period. Her voice was steady. Her reasoning was coherent. She was genuinely very good at this. "The land in question," Aiden said, "has been under active cultivation by a pack member for 8 years. That history constitutes a use claim that predates the consolidation and is recognized under the Unified Territories governing structure." A pause. "The marker will come down tonight." Then he did something I didn't expect. He looked at me, directly, across the full width of the assembly, and said, "The grove on the northern slope is a pack asset. It will be maintained and supported as such, with the same resource access extended to any territorial cultivation project." The room was very quiet. I was aware of every face turning toward me with a range of expressions I didn't have the bandwidth to catalog individually. I was aware of Petra, near the middle of the crowd, with an expression that might have been something close to shame. I was aware of Senna, who had named me in this same hall weeks ago, looking at the floor. I was aware, most of all, of the particular quality of being publicly acknowledged after years of public dismissal. The way it doesn't feel triumphant, exactly. It feels like something tearing very carefully along a seam that has been held too tight for too long. I kept my face composed. It took everything I had. The boundary marker came down that night. Cole removed it personally, which told me something about how seriously Aiden took the symbolic dimension of the gesture. It wasn't delegated to anyone who might do it carelessly. I went up to the slope after the assembly and stood in the dark among my trees for a long time. The moon was high and almost full, and in its light the birches were silver, and the ash trees were a deep architectural black, and the whole grove had the quality of a place that exists at a different frequency than ordinary space. Quieter, more itself, indifferent to human politics in the way that only living things with centuries ahead of them can afford to be. I was still there when I heard footsteps on the path. I knew them by now. Aiden came up through the silver dark and stopped a few feet away, and we stood together among the trees without speaking for a while. This had become, without either of us formally deciding it, a kind of language between us. The silence that wasn't absence but presence. The kind of quiet that only exists between people who have stopped needing to perform anything for each other. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "I think so." I paused. I didn't expect the public acknowledgement. I know. I thought about whether to do it privately. He was quiet for a moment. But the dismissal was public. 8 years of it. The correction needed to be public too. I turned to look at him. In the moonlight, his face was less guarded than I had ever seen it. Not open exactly, but the careful neutrality was thinner here, up here away from everything, as though the altitude or the trees or some combination of both had worn it down to something more honest underneath. "You've been carrying something," I said. It came out before I'd decided to say it. He didn't deflect it. "Yes. The Eastern Territory, before you came here." A long pause. The wind moved through the birches, and they made their particular sound. A dry whispering that always seemed to me less like noise and more like the trees thinking out loud. "I made a decision 6 years ago," he said slowly, "that I believed was right. I had the information I needed, the counsel I trusted, the authority to act. And the decision was wrong in a way that cost people I was responsible for something they couldn't get back." He stopped. Started again. "Not because I was careless, because I was certain. And certainty, without the friction of genuine doubt, is just arrogance wearing a different coat. I thought about that. About the specific grief of being competent and still wrong. About how much harder that is to carry than simple failure. "Is that why you listened to me?" I said. "About the pack?" "Partly." He looked at me directly. "Partly it's because you're the only person in this territory who has spent 8 years doing something difficult and true with no audience and no reward, and that tells me more about a person's character than anything I could learn in a formal meeting." The moonlight came through the birch branches and fell between us in fragments, white and irregular. "I'm an omega with a grove that people laughed at," I said. "You're a woman who prepared ground for oak trees she'll never see fully grown," he said, "because she believed the ground was worth preparing. That's not a small thing, Clara. That's the only thing, really. Everything else is just noise." I felt the words settle somewhere deep, in a place that had been empty for a very long time. We stayed up there until the moon had moved significantly across the sky, talking and not talking in equal measure. He told me about the Eastern Territory in more detail. The landscape, the specific quality of the cold there, the people he'd led, and what he'd learned from leading them wrong and then trying to lead them right. I told him about arriving in Ashevale with 2 bags, and a silence that people mistook for emptiness. About the first tree that died within a week. About pressing my palm against the cold earth and deciding to try again. At some point, the wind picked up from the north, carrying the first real edge of the coming winter. And without discussion, we moved to the sheltered side of the largest ash tree where the trunk cut the wind. We stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of him at my shoulder, and neither of us moved away, and neither of us named what that meant. Not yet. But in the dark grove with the moonlight coming through silver branches and the mountain rising black above us, I thought about oak trees and long patience and the specific kind of faith required to prepare ground for something you can't yet see. I thought, the ground has been prepared a long time. Then, from somewhere lower on the mountain, distant but unmistakable in the night's clarity, came a sound that was not wind and not animal, and not anything that belonged to a quiet October dark. It was the particular sound of something wrong. Aiden went still beside me. I felt it before I saw it. The shift in him from present to alert, from the man who had been standing in my grove in the moonlight, to something older and more instinctive. "Stay here," he said. "What is—" But he was already moving down the slope, fast and silent, and below us the lights of the settlement were wrong. Too many of them, moving in patterns that didn't match ordinary late-night activity. I stayed among my trees for exactly 30 seconds. Then I followed. The fire had started in the storage building at the settlement's eastern edge. Not an accident. That was clear within the first minutes of reaching the lower ground, where the smell was wrong, sharper than ordinary burning, with a chemical edge that didn't come from wood and old timber alone. Someone had helped it start. The building held the Consolidated Territories' primary winter supply reserves, the food stores, the medical materials, the emergency fuel. Losing it entirely, heading into the hardest months, would have been more than a setback. It would have been a crisis engineered to look like misfortune. By the time I reached the settlement's edge, Aiden was already coordinating, not shouting, not running, but moving through the organized chaos with that same quality of presence that restructured whatever space he occupied. Cole was at his left, receiving and dispatching information in rapid, low exchanges. A line of pack members had formed at the water station, passing containers in a chain toward the eastern building. The fire was large but not yet catastrophic. Whatever had started it had been discovered early, by a young beta named Finn, who'd been awake with a sick child in the adjacent residence and had smelled the accelerant before the flames had fully taken. That early discovery was the difference between a devastating loss and a manageable one. I went to where I could be useful, which was not at the fire line. I had no training for that. But at the residence hall where the families with children had been directed. Someone needed to manage that space, and no one had been assigned to it, which was a gap I could fill. I spent the next 2 hours keeping the space calm, keeping the younger children occupied, making certain that the older members who'd been displaced from the eastern residences had water and warmth, and someone to tell them plainly what was happening. Petra found me there, sometime past midnight. She stood in the doorway of the hall, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Stripped of the practical remove she usually wore, something more uncertain underneath. "You're good at this," she said. Not with surprise exactly, with the particular tone of someone revising a long-held assumption and finding the revision uncomfortable. "Someone needed to do it," I said. "Clara." She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. The children nearest us were asleep, finally, wrapped in whatever blankets had been gathered quickly. I said the trees didn't help anything, 8 years ago. I remember. I was wrong. She said it plainly, without decoration, in the voice of someone who had decided that the discomfort of saying it was less than the discomfort of not saying it. Not just about the trees, about what they meant, about you. I looked at her for a moment. Then, "I know you were trying to protect me, in your way." She blinked. Hadn't expected that. "Telling me it was pointless," I said. "It was your version of don't draw attention, don't make yourself a target. I know what it looks like. I've spent years watching people protect themselves by making themselves smaller. You were trying to tell me how to do the same." "That doesn't make it right." "No," I agreed, "but it makes it human." She sat down heavily on the nearest bench. After a moment, I sat beside her, and we stayed there in the warm, dim room with the sleeping children around us, not speaking for a while, which was its own kind of arriving. The investigation into the fire took 4 days. It confirmed what the smell had already told anyone paying attention. Accelerant, deliberately placed, timed for the deep night hours when discovery would be unlikely. The trail, when Aiden's people followed it with the careful patience of those who knew how to look, led back to 2 members of Marin's inner circle, not Marin herself, which was either fortunate or the result of someone more intelligent than those she'd trusted to act for her. And either way, left the question of her knowledge permanently unanswerable. Aiden handled it with the same quality he brought to everything, directly, without spectacle, with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The 2 members responsible were removed from the territory. The associated network of low-level obstruction, the supply reversals, the quietly circulated opinions, the sustained campaign to make the consolidation feel unstable, was named and dismantled. Marin herself he met with privately. I didn't know what was said in that meeting. What I knew was that when it was over, she resigned her administrative role and accepted a restructured position with significantly reduced authority. And when she passed me in the settlement 2 days later, she looked at me with an expression that had nothing of the old dismissal in it. Something more complicated. Not guilt exactly. Too proud for guilt. But perhaps the particular knowledge of someone who has understood too late, that they misjudged the ground they were standing on. I nodded to her. She nodded back. It was enough. The morning after the investigation concluded, I went up to the grove at dawn as I always had. The mountain was sharp and clear after several days of cloud, the sky an almost painful blue, the frost thick on the ground. The birches had lost their last leaves now and stood white and bare in the early light, their architecture exposed, beautiful in a different way than their autumn gold, structural and honest. I was checking the oak saplings. All 4 had survived, which filled me with a disproportionate joy that I didn't try to moderate. When I heard the footsteps on the path below, I didn't turn around immediately. I finished what I was checking, pressed my fingers into the soil around the base of the smallest oak, confirmed that the drainage channel we dug had done its work. Then I stood and turned. Aiden came up through the bare birches in the early light and stopped a few feet away, and he looked at me with an expression that had none of its usual careful neutrality in it. The distance had come down, all of it, or most of it. Whatever he'd been managing in his face for weeks was simply not there anymore. The oaks made it, I said. I can see that. He came forward and crouched beside the nearest one, checking with his own hands the way he'd started doing as though the habit had simply transferred from me to him over weeks of shared mornings. The drainage held. Yes. He stood, turned to face me. I've been thinking, he said, about what I want this territory to be. And I want it to be a place where the northern slope is a resource, not a joke. Where the people who've been doing difficult quiet work at the edges are brought to the center, not because it's politically useful, but because that's where the actual intelligence of a community lives. He paused. I want it to be a place where someone can plant an oak tree and know that the ground will still be safe when that tree is old. I looked at him steadily. That's a large ambition. Yes, you'll need people who can see clearly, from the edges and from the center. I know. His voice was very level. I'm hoping one of them will agree to stop being at the edges. The mountain was very quiet around us. The frost glittered on every surface. The birch branches made their bare, delicate lines against the blue sky, and the ash trees at the center of the grove stood as they had always stood, shaped by difficulty, honest in their form, absolutely themselves. I'm not interested in a role, I said carefully. I'm not interested in being useful to a structure. I know. I'm not offering a role. He held my gaze. I'm asking you to help me build something that lasts. The way you build things. With patience. With real preparation. Without the guarantee of seeing the result. I'm asking because you understand that kind of work better than anyone I've met. A pause. And because I've spent every morning for the past 6 weeks finding reasons to be on this hillside before the rest of the territory is awake, and the reasons have been increasingly unrelated to pack governance. The directness of it moved through me like the first warm day after a long cold, sudden, almost disorienting, entirely real. I thought about 8 years of pressing my palms into difficult soil. About the first tree that died and the choice to try again. About preparing ground for oak trees that neither of us would see fully grown, because the preparation itself was the point, because something should want to grow here, because the ground was worth it. "I've been alone on this slope for 8 years," I said. "I know. I don't need to not be alone. I'm telling you that clearly. I've made my peace with it." "I know that too." Something in his expression, warm and certain and slightly worn at the edges, in the way that I had come to understand, was his truest face. "I'm not asking because you need it. I'm asking because I do." The frost was beginning to melt in the first direct sunlight, small drops forming and falling from the birch branches, a sound like the very beginning of something. "All right," I said. Not a performance of certainty, not the answer arrived at through calculation. Just the simple truth of it, plain and real. He crossed the distance between us and put his hand against my face with the same unhurried care he brought to everything. The same hands that had checked the frost depth in the soil, that had dug a drainage channel in the cold, that had pressed briefly against the bark of my oldest ash tree on the very first morning. I leaned into it and felt 8 years of careful held distance dissolve, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow and honest way that things dissolve when the time for them to dissolve has genuinely arrived. The oak trees were 12 years old when they first gave significant shade. I know this because I was there for every one of those years, on the northern slope of the Asheville territory, in the mornings before the rest of the settlement was fully awake, sometimes alone, because solitude remained a thing I needed, and Aiden understood that without needing it explained, and sometimes not alone, because the grove had become over time something the pack came to rather than laughed at, a place where the older children were brought to learn what patience looked like in living form, and where the community's difficult decisions were sometimes talked through in the particular clarity that only exists away from walls and roofs. Marin came once in the 3rd year. She stood at the center of the grove among the ash trees and looked for a long time without speaking. Then she said, to no one in particular, I didn't understand what it was. I told her that was all right. I think I meant it. Petra became, in her thorough and unsentimental way, one of the grove's most reliable caretakers. She never romanticized it, never called it anything more than what it was. But she showed up on difficult maintenance days and worked beside me with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and that was more than sufficient. Senna planted her own section, along the western edge. Hawthorn and rowan, which suited her, complicated and thorny, and full of small red things that birds loved in winter. Cole, who retired from active duty in the 7th year and settled in the territory permanently with his family, built a path marker at the base of the slope that simply read, North Grove, Est, 8 years before anyone paid attention. Aiden laughed when he saw it, a real laugh, unguarded, which still had the capacity to surprise me even after years of hearing it. Finn, the young beta who had been awake with his sick child the night of the fire, whose early discovery had changed everything, named his second daughter Clara, which I only found out because his wife told me at a harvest gathering, and I had to excuse myself for a moment to collect my composure in private. The oak trees gave shade in their 12th year, and I stood under it one October morning with my palms flat against the bark, still my oldest habit, my most private gesture, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed, not finished, completed. There is a difference. Finished means it ends. Completed means it has become what it was always trying to be, and now simply is. Aiden found me there, as he had found me there hundreds of mornings before, and stood beside me with his shoulder against mine, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the trees hadn't already said better. The mountain rose above us, indifferent and permanent and beautiful in the way that only truly old things are beautiful, not despite their difficulty, but because of it. The sky was the pale clear blue of late autumn, stretched thin and honest over everything. Below, the settlement moved through its day, The pack that had laughed and learned and slowly, in the imperfect, non-linear, genuinely human way, become something that deserved the ground it stood on. The oaks grew. They would keep growing long after all of us were gone, their roots deep in the prepared earth, their branches reaching toward a sky that had always been there, patient and indifferent and full of light. That was enough. That was everything.